Hey, everyone. We have a special conversation for all of you today. Look, the Trump administration says the debate is over. It appears that it was a lab leak that caused the pandemic. Just days ago, the president signed a new executive order effectively stopping gain-of-function research, which is the kind of research the administration says was behind the alleged leak, while the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, is saying, stay tuned. She is working on the definitive report into the lab leak. And Senator Rand Paul is once again vowing revenge on Anthony Fauci. Debate over, right? Not exactly. Many scientists are telling us that the evidence still very much points to this being the result of the virus spreading at a wet market from animal to human, not the lab. And they feel like nobody really wants to hear that anymore. So today, as President Trump declares that scientists were behind the most destructive pandemic of the past 100 years, we facilitate a conversation about where the facts are pointing to. Okay, and before we get started, a little note on the audio quality you're about to hear. Yours truly kind of fucked up and didn't save the high quality version of this, so you're getting a slightly lower quality version. I felt really bad about it, but the conversation I thought was too good to let go because of some shitty audio quality. But just so you know, we will get back up to our high HD quality on subsequent episodes. Thank you for understanding. Let's get started. Hey guys, welcome. Welcome. I'm Brinda Adhikari.
I am Tom Johnson.
I'm Dr. Maggie Bartlett.
Brinda and I are journalists. Maggie's a virologist. And Mark, for all his fans out there, Mark is off today.
So listen, we have a special episode for all of you today. We want to facilitate a conversation between two scientists and a journalist to kind of get us up to speed on where we are today in our understanding of how COVID came into our lives. And look, I just want to start off by saying, like, why are we doing this? Why do we keep fucking talking about where COVID came from? And the truth is, it's not us. Like we said in the beginning, the Trump administration has effectively made this, what Tulsi Gabbard said in that interview with Megyn Kelly, which we will put in our show notes, that this is a priority for this administration. It is like Jay Bhattacharya is developing a report about the origins, and they're really going all in on the lab leak. If you look at the COVID.Gov site, I mean, it looks like the movie poster for Blade Runner, Tom. It's like,
really does.
Mm-hmm.
It is like dark.
Trump
I
striding.
It was a meme when someone sent it to me.
Yeah, it is dark and scary. And then the other part of it is I had a conversation with someone who's like fairly skeptical of the establishment when it comes to public health and medicine and stuff. And, you know, when I told him that there were scientists out there who really don't think it was a lab leak, he was like, wait, what? I thought they all kind of are waving the white flag on this, that everyone believes now it was a lab leak. They're just not talking about it. Yeah, and then when I called up those scientists and they were like, no. But I think there is some fear out there, and there's a sense that I'm vibing of like some resignation on the part of a lot of folks in science who are like, fuck this. Like, I'm not going to do this anymore. Like, they're pinning us to a wall about this, so I'm not going to do this. And so, look, we wanted to bring them together. And let's do a couple of intros. So, look, these are three friends of the pod. They've all been on the pod before. We like them. We trust them. We get a beer with them. Bagel, whatever, you know. The first is Dr. Paul Offit. He's an infectious disease pediatrician with Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP. Hi, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Hey, how you guys doing?
We got Dr. Maciek Boni, an infectious disease epidemiologist, a professor at Temple University, who early on in the pandemic was on a research team trying to figure out where this thing came from. Hi, Dr. Maciek. How are you?
Very good. How's everyone?
Good.
And last but not least, we have David Wallace-Wells, who's a science writer and a columnist with the New York Times, who also reported throughout the pandemic and has focused a lot on COVID origins. Hi, David. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Awesome.
Good.
Well, listen, welcome to Why Should I Trust You? We're really psyched you're here. And before we dive in, Tom, why don't you get us up to speed on what the state of play is right now concerning this debate on COVID origins?
Yeah, so if you haven't visited the COVID.Gov website, you should. Brenda mentioned it at the top. You know, and it does look like it's promoting some action movie. You got Trump looking stern and determined. He's marching right through the big words lab, leak. The subhead of the thing is the true origins of COVID-19. The COVID-19 part is like written in cursive. The message is just rock solid. COVID was leaked from a lab. U.S. government scientists and others, led by Anthony Fauci, covered it up. You get the drift. And
there's an interesting jab by Andrew Cuomo also on that.
Yes, there's a jab at Cuomo. You've got Biden's pardon. You've got a cool Jason Bourne map showing the Wuhan market in relation to the lab.
I would totally watch this movie.
You'd watch it too. And Maggie, why don't you bring us up to speed on Tulsi Gabbard?
America's Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said she's working with NIH Director Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to investigate the origins of the COVID pandemic. And as we mentioned already at the top, Senator Rand Paul is not backing off his war against Anthony Fauci, posting on X that Anthony Fauci thought he set off into the sunset and we forgot about him. But that's the furthest thing from the truth. He will be held accountable for his role in the pandemic and the COVID cover-up.
Yeah, and then you got the Trump, Maggie, you can sort of explain this. I think that Trump signs this executive order just the other day, which is further restricting this gain of function research, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this executive order, it's basically that the research that the Trump administration believes is behind the lab leak. So this move, of course, comes as the administration is reshaping American science across the board and health policy and has resulted in massive layoffs, scientists with deep cuts to research, to public health, to the scientific research community, both in the federal government and also to universities across the country. And we're all really feeling this moment in science.
Yeah. And then, we have these intelligence agencies chiming in on all this. The CIA said, of course, earlier this year that COVID was more likely to have originated in a lab. It said that with low confidence. And, it's important to keep in mind that the CIA now joins the FBI, the Department of Energy, but other agencies haven't, they're not agreeing with that declaration. They're not going as far. But, as Brinda says, this seems to be a top priority for this administration. And, she mentioned Bhattacharya saying this is a top priority for him. Gabbard, top priority. John Ratcliffe, when he was sworn in, to head up the CIA, said that an examination of the origins of COVID was a top one, day one priority for him. So, they're going full force with this, and we can debate the reasons for that. As the Washington Post put it the other day, they said, the war for public opinion on this was won long ago. And, polls, which, we've talked about this before in the pod, polls find that about 2/3 of Americans believe that the pandemic began with a lab leak in China.
Right. And so, look, I think that's a pretty nice setup for why we're having this conversation. And look, I don't have a dog in this. I don't have a raccoon dog in this fight. You see what I did there?
Yeah.
By the way, if you've ever seen a picture of a raccoon dog, they fucking look like raccoon dogs. It's a raccoon and a dog.
Very cute.
They're very cute.
Are you going to get one, Brinda?
They're adorable. But all that to say that, what we like to do on the show, when a conversation feels stuck in the mud, we got to unstick it somehow. And this conversation, to us, feels stuck in the mud, even if the administration has decided game over. So, look, we want to bring these guys in, David, Paul, Maciek. We're, creating our own broadcast, our manosphere right here. I feel like I should ask you how much you bench press. But I'm not going to do that because I know the answer, because you guys are all nerds. So, what I want to do right now, is really just ask, look, what is your reaction to this? That it's game over, lab leak decided. And, I want to start with you, David. What are your first initial thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's just unfortunate that we've moved into a cultural space in which either side feels the need to be so definitive about this. I think this is a question, personally, I feel is open, probably will remain open forever. We can talk about how we measure probabilities, but anyone who is offering, I think, a really definitive argument that we know for sure this virus came to us in one way or another, I tend to think that they're being disingenuous. And I'm really disturbed by the fact that the administration is being so affirmative and short-footed about it. I'm worried about that on a truth basis. I'm also worried about that on a geopolitical level. I think it's really important to understand that this whole argument has taken place in the context of American fights over science and authority, but has also taken place in the context of, a global rivalry between the U.S. and China. And, we're living now in a moment of increasingly heightened tensions between the two countries. And I think it's not an accident that the Trump administration is sort of, leaning into a lab leak story as they're leaning into every other form of confrontation with China. One of the things that I think is interesting about that and somewhat complicated, though, is that they've also somewhat moved on from really talking about the Chinese responsibility and are much more interested in blaming the pandemic on American epidemiologists and virologists, and in particular on Tony Fauci. And so you have a whole culture war fight being waged. It almost doesn't matter to the Trump team who they're blaming, so long as they're blaming someone or some institution they can imagine they're holding accountable. But personally, I don't think that the evidence set that we have has changed all that much over the last year. I don't even really think it's changed all that much over the last 3 years. And I think that my own view is that we're probably doomed to be living in some degree of uncertainty on this question going forward, which is uncomfortable for anyone who wants to reckon with the pandemic as a world historical phenomenon and try to make sense of how it happened and what it's meant for all of us.
Well, look, Maciek, American history on this topic is effectively like, if it were being written right now, and it seems like some people are trying, like they would say it's a lab leak. 2/3 of the country believe it was a lab leak. You were part of the investigative team looking into the origins of the virus. Where's your head go when you hear all this stuff?
Well, I'll start with David's last comment on where the evidence base has been over the last 3 years. It really hasn't changed much. In January, February 2020, we knew that the virus was first identified at a market. We had the genome of the virus. So all the suspicion initially was at the market. This is the way that pathogens like this emerge from animal populations into human populations. And then for a couple of years, we had, a public argument essentially between people who thought it came from a lab and people that thought it emerged naturally. And some of the evidence was assembled during this time. So where was the virus first found and what were the genetic lineages? That told us something about where it probably emerged in November 2019. But the last 3 years, I think it's just been a lot of promotion, changing websites, trying to persuade people. But since 2022, maybe 2023, the evidence base has basically been the same.
Paul, what do you think about all this?
Well, I'm glad the administration's made this a priority. It should be a priority. We've had 3 pandemic coronaviruses in the last 20 years. We had SARS-1 in 2002, we had MERS in 2012, and now we have this virus, SARS-CoV-2, in 2019. I think it's fair to say there'll be another pandemic. So it would be nice to know what the origin is so that we can, at the very least, respond quickly and at best prevent it. I'm sort of with Maciek on this. I think that we do have a fair amount of data on, for example, where people were first reported as being infected. I think we do have sort of genetic evidence looking at samples taken from carts and feather removers and the machines that were used to kill the animals and cages for evidence that SARS-CoV-2 virus was there. And you have phylogenetic data looking at the people who were initially infected and compared it to that. And then you have mammalian DNA in that area with, showing that there's palm civets and raccoon dogs and bamboo rats, which could be secondary hosts. So I think that I have come down on the fact that all the evidence to date sort of at least moves me to the fact that this was an animal to human spillover. And it is a scientific question, so it should be answered, therefore, in a scientific venue. And I appreciate that people like Michael Warby and Chris Anderson and Eddie Holmes publish papers in, Nature and Science and Cell and subject themselves to peer review. I don't see that on the lab leak side, where people are submitting their evidence for peer review. And so I guess it's been frustrating in that sense.
What I'm wondering is, David, in this moment, it's not just the sort of the DNA trail that people are talking about. They're also talking about the funding and the research and things like that, right? So I'm wondering, David, can you run with this a little bit and kind of get into what are the real concerns and the best faith arguments that people are making about why they don't think this was a wet market?
Well, I would start by saying I think that the evidence that has been assembled on either side doesn't add up to a proof. And we can talk about the limitations of the lab leak thesis. I think there are limitations there. Personally, I start with the fact that, nearly all jumps of new viruses into humans have happened through, zoonotic jumps, and probably as a sort of baseline, we should anchor our expectations there. But there are other reasons to believe, just as a sort of as a base case that we should be treating this as a natural origin until proven otherwise. That said, a lot of what's been offered over the last few years as arguments in favor of natural origin, I think, that work has been somewhat oversold. So we do have, a heavy sample of early cases clustered around the market, but those cases were found, several months after the first case. The sampling was done, at least 6 weeks, 8 weeks after that. The sampling was done intentionally around the market, so it's not necessarily reflective of the city as a whole. The sampling that was done within the market of the stalls, the places where there was some evidence of the virus, there's arguments about this, but, the micro locations where we found the most were not places where the animals that were we thought were likely carriers are likely to be. The highest intense concentrations were, I think, in a bathroom in a mahjong room where there were people clustered. And this is not to say that this is not, we should discard all this science entirely. I just think it means that there are questions about the how confident we should be that this research really points in one direction or the other. And what I would say at a meta level about all of that is that it's just a sign that we are somewhat looking into a black hole here. We can do genetic work. This is work that I'm the least qualified person on this call to talk about, but there may be some genetic work to do to look through the history of the virus. Maybe in the future we'll have new techniques. But the truth is we had the period in which the virus jumped into humans. We don't have a very clear sense of really what was happening. We're doing detective work there. We weren't doing mass sampling at the time. We don't know exactly who the first case truly was. There are a lot of questions about, the timeline there. And ultimately, though the Chinese provided us some samples, they were, weeks after the initial event. And to my mind, there's a plausible case that what we are looking at with the cluster of early cases around the market is that this was a site of a super spreading event quite early on. Again, that's not to say I think this means that this jumped from a lab, but it does mean that to me, the question is open, and that, we're trying to piece together a picture. We're probably revealing as much about our initial biases when we make a claim in one direction or another as we are about the evidence before us. And I think, given the mystery and the ambiguity of this question, I think it's important for us to start to think about what it means to assess these questions in a probabilistic way under cover of uncertainty. And I've written before, it's like if you think that there's a 5% chance that this came out of a lab, that probably still means something quite serious about how we should be governing research of this kind. You don't need to get all the way to 100%. You don't even need to get to 51%. If there's a 5% chance that a disease that killed probably 30 million people around the world and disrupted the lives of 8 billion people around the world was the result of a lab accident, we should be taking much more seriously the way that we do research in these settings and ensure that whatever happened in the past will never happen again. I think so many Americans went through this experience and are so unhappy with how it went. And they have different complaints. Some people complain about government overreach. Some people complain about the indifference of their fellow citizens to their own health. And some people focus on school closure. Some people talk about lockdowns. And often they're using these terms in, I think, somewhat misleading ways. But it's a sign that almost everyone who experienced this pandemic was unhappy with how it went. And that is a sign, I think, of what a world historical event it was for all of us, that we all have all these complaints. And one of the things that the lab leak hypothesis allows us to do is to pin the blame in a very discrete way and allow us to avoid reckoning with the fact that this reveals our basic biological frailty and vulnerability. And as Paul was saying a few minutes ago, it allows us to, overlook or ignore the possibility that we may be dealing with another one of these events relatively soon. If we can say it came out of this lab, which was a result of this grant and this support of this kind of research by this figure, well, then we can, fire those people, cancel those grants, maybe in theory, throw them in jail, all the people who want to do that. And we can sort of solve the problem forever. And I do think that that's one of the big reasons why this story has gotten such a purchase in the American public and become such a touchstone, because for many people, it allows them to believe that the pandemic was avoidable and that it was some discrete person or set of persons' fault.
Well, I'll jump in on David's points because, David, you got to this point on overselling what scientists knew and how strongly they could conclude something. And, we didn't realize in early 2020 that we'd be submitting things for scientific peer review. Scientists would form opinions on that, but that also the public would have an opinion on that. So swaying public opinion or knowing how the public's going to react to something is not something that we were planning for or expecting. And we were, kind of targeting our work to see what other scientists would think of it and how they would come back and criticize it. And so I don't know what this all looked like in 22 and 23 while the argument was happening, but certainly in early 2020, everybody knows about these two early publications. There was the proximal origins paper and the Lancet letter. And they did use language that we use very routinely in science. We find it highly implausible that there's a strong probability that something occurred one way or another, but then it gets translated into public language, and now you don't know how the public is going to read it or what mood they'll be in or how bad things are. And so the Lancet letter, which was published in mid-February 2020, when we essentially had the genome and just like the early description of the market outbreaks, that Lancet letter used the phrase overwhelmingly conclude. And, if we're now entering into a pandemic and people are dying, this is going to rub the public in the wrong way. And we didn't know in mid-February what all the consequences of these short letters was going to be.
I think it's really interesting to think about that particular early period, because I do think personally that those two publications reveal some, I don't want to quite say misconduct, but, if we could go back in time, I would advise some of those scientists to change some of their language and maybe approach the subject differently. Also advise many of the people who are talking about that work in public to soften their language somewhat. But I also think it's a little bit of a mistake that many people on the lab leak side of things have made to treat this period as a period of widespread government censorship, where there was only one message that was legible to the public, and it was that it was definitively a disease of natural origin. This was a period of time when Donald Trump was talking about the possibility. Mike Pompeo was talking about the possibility. You had, figures like Alina Chan at Boston University talking about this. And the polls show that that this period, from February to May, was actually a period of time in 2020, which is the time in which, theoretically the message was being most forcefully put forward, that we know for sure that this is a zoonotic origin. This was a period of time in which American public opinion actually shifted quite dramatically in favor of a lab leak. So the polls that we have from March of 2020 show that about 1/3 of Americans in March of 2020 believed that the disease had come from a lab. And by May of 2020, that had crossed 40%. I think it was at 49% by May of 2020. So this period of time, which is now remembered in retrospect as a period of intense censorship by the government and social media companies on behalf of the scientific establishment, and in particular on behalf of Tony Fauci, was actually the period in which we saw the biggest jump in Americans believing that this came out of a lab. And one of the things that tells me is that when people object to that censorship regime and object to the messaging and object to the quasi-conspiratorial behavior of scientists in trying to manage this information, they're not actually saying that the information was prevented from getting out. What they're saying was that they were able to process enough of the information on their own that they came to a conclusion, and then they found it kind of offensive that the people in positions of authority were telling them that they were wrong. And in that way, I think it's a kind of comparable dynamic to what we saw in the last election cycle, where many Americans thought Joe Biden was too old, but they felt that the Democrats were lying to them about it being too old. It's not that they didn't see themselves that Joe Biden was old. They saw it enough to believe that he shouldn't be running for president, but they found it offensive that many people that they might have wanted to look up to were telling them that they were incorrect and underinformed. And I think that that's the real dynamic here.
Right. Paul, let me bring you in because I want to go to the other part that really fuels the mistrust, which is the funding for this and the idea that this gain of function research was something that the previous administration, the Obama administration, had put restrictions on, and Anthony Fauci somehow circumvented that. And that's fueling a lot of this, in which now we have this executive order. So talk to us, explain gain of function research, and then also what is is there any reason why some of that mistrust is warranted?
So gain of function research is that you alter, in this case, a virus to the point that it is more virulent than what you started with. So for example, I think in 2014 it was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, there was a study done where they took an influenza virus. Influenza are bird viruses, most of which are not adapted to growth in people, and they tried to adapt that virus to growth in ferrets, which are like us mammals. So now you were taking an avian virus, you were trying to manipulate it to the point that it could then grow in people. This virus that pretty much no one had immunity to in the world. That was seen as dangerous, and so sort of gave birth to the notion of banning this kind of gain of function research. I think, and Maciek may know this better than I do, but I think a few years later that was paused. That kind of thing was paused. But not all gain of function research results in function that is gained. I mean, if you look, for example, at what happened with Xi Jiangli, who was disparagingly referred to by Rand Paul as the bat lady. And I guess I see.
And just remind us who she was.
She was sort of the lead virologist at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and a well-known and respected virologist internationally. That she did work where she took this WIV1 strain of coronavirus, and which was not pathogenic for people, and then did experiments where she mixed that virus with one of 8 different bat coronaviruses. No function was gained, and although that money, the money that came through for that, I think was from NIAID through the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease and part of NIH through EcoHealth and then to this laboratory. It was gain of function where no function was gained. I guess when Dr. Fauci was testifying in front of Rand Paul, he could have spent more time explaining that rather than simply saying, no, there wasn't gain of function research. I mean, technically, when we created the bovine human reassortant rotavirus vaccine, that was gain of function research. Technically, I mean, no function was gained. Not surprisingly, we take a strong virus like a human rotavirus and mix it with a weak virus for humans, a bovine rotavirus. Usually, what happens is you make the strong virus weak, and which is what happened for us. And now we have a vaccine that works. So the term is somewhat loose, but I think Maciek probably has a better sense of the variance of how one would consider gain of research. There's sort of different levels of gain of function research.
Yeah,
Can I jump in actually for a second?
Yeah, go.
It's funny. I talked to Tony Fauci about this a couple of years ago when I was talking about the whole scope of the pandemic, and I made the same point that you just did, which is people use gain of function in a variety of ways. The NIAID used it in a very particular way, and he was answering that way, but it was at least intended. He understood that he could have answered in a more expansive way, and that would have probably served Rand Paul's purposes more, and he chose to answer in a narrower way and be much more emphatic than he needed to. And I think this is quite illustrative of the story as a whole, which is to say there are missteps by public communicators and people in government and scientists all along the way here. I do think Fauci should have answered that question differently. I think that when Congress required, the intelligence agencies to release their full report, they should have released a full report rather than a redacted report. There have been some reports that some whistleblowers that some analysts were actually paid to change their assessment ahead of that, and that should be looked into. And all along, I think, there are instances of figures in taking the public stage and being more emphatic about their certainty about the origin of the virus than they really should have been. And I do think that was, bad behavior that we might wish had been handled differently. But I also think we're in a really dark place when we're blaming the whole, turn against science and the scientific establishment on these relatively minor missteps in public communication. I do think that, it's really important to keep in mind the broader context here, where many figures many of whom are now empowered in the Trump administration, including Rand Paul, spent much of the pandemic really looking for ways to weaponize the experience against their enemies in the scientific world and in the government. And all of these instances that we could point to and say, we handled this poorly, we should have communicated more clearly, we should have been more nuanced and caveated. We can learn those lessons, but I don't think that we're in the bind we're in with many people not just sure that the pandemic came out of a lab, but in fact sure that many very powerful people conspired to prevent them from knowing that. We're not in that position because a couple of comments were made, without quite enough nuance. We're in that position because many quite bad faith actors were engaged over a period of years in weaponizing those missteps for their own benefit. And I'm here, I think, as somewhat of a representative of the lab origin side of the argument. But I just want to keep in mind that many of the people who feel strongly about a lab origin, I think, are really truly acting in bad faith, not looking closely at the science, not really engaging with the counter arguments, and seizing anything they can to attack the people that they hate.
But what you had used a phrase before, which I'll push back on a little bit, the term scientific elites. I think there are scientists who are not scientific elites. I would say. I think if, for example, Anderson and Holmes and Moraby had a three-way conversation on a podcast called Decoding the Gurus. It was about a 2-hour and 45-minute conversation. It was a scientific conversation, but it's exactly what you want to hear. What do we know? What don't we know? How can we fill in the gaps? Because a good scientist will never go beyond the data that's in front of them. And it's exactly the conversation that you wanted to hear. But you would have to have had some scientific knowledge to understand this. Just taking a step back. There has never before in human history been a virus that's been created in a laboratory, either accidentally or purposefully, that went on to kill, in this case, millions of people. Never. So you would argue that it's a fantastic claim. It's an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims, if you believe Carl Sagan, should be backed by extraordinary evidence. And I think the evidence for the lab leak is largely sort of conspiracy and innuendo, whereas the evidence, I think, for an animal-to-human spillover event, which happens, as Maciek said earlier, all the time. SARS-1 was an animal-to-human spillover event. MERS was an animal-to-human spillover event. Ebola is a bat virus. Mpox is a rodent virus. HIV was a chimp virus. These are all animal-to-human spillover events. So that's the likely explanation for which we have a reasonable amount of data to support it, but it's not definitive. And look at HIV, for example. Now we know that HIV probably was derived from chimps in Cameroon in the 1930s. It took a while to get there, and it may take a while to get here, but I'll be curious to hear.
I think I share a lot of your feelings about this broad perspective, but I would push back in sort of the same way I pushed back against some of the earlier statements you made, which is to say, it's true. We have many more examples of zoonotic jumps. We do have a lot of examples of lab leaks, not of engineered viruses, but of viruses coming out of labs, in some cases creating quite large problems. There's the second outbreak of SARS-1 and I believe also the Russian flu, right? In any event, we are seeing, the deeper we look, we see more examples of these problems of viruses escaping from the lab. And I would say in that context, it's important to keep in mind when balancing these two sets of data, we've only been doing gain-of-function research for a couple of decades, right? So it's, on some level, it's not fair to look at the whole history of human interaction with viruses and say, well, we have all of these instances of diseases coming from nature, and we don't have a comparable example of one coming out of a lab, because this kind of work is only a couple of decades old. And when you compress yeah, sorry, go ahead. You know this history better than I do, I'm sure.
I think there's a big difference between, of course, things can leak from a lab. There was a smallpox leak in England that was devastating.
Yep.
Killed somebody. But there's a difference between a lab leak and somebody intentionally or unintentionally creating a virus that caused the pandemic. That's a very different thing. But
we also know that in these labs, they're doing work that is making viruses more pathogenic, right? So,
this is good. It's getting spicy. I like it. Maciek, weigh in. There's a bunch of things that we've said. We've talked about gain of function.
One thing just to jump in, Brinda, for Maciek, and just for our listeners here, a lot of the zoonotic theory, or that this came from animals and mutated and spread to humans, a lot of that's based on data that was collected around the marketplace. David talked about that. Others have talked about it. They found the earliest cases in humans were sort of clustered around the marketplace, people who either worked there or didn't work there, but that's kind of where it was found. And they also went around, sampled, took swabs inside the marketplace and found that those swabs tested positive for COVID. Just answer the critics of that theory that said either the Chinese, can't trust them, they were biased and went straight to the marketplace because they were searching for that to be the answer. Or, the other critique, which is just, it's a big bustling place with lots of humans, and it probably was a super spreader location. It's not too far from the lab. Someone got sick in the lab, walked out, went out for lunch. Just take on some of the basic criticisms of the animal to human argument.
Sure. So the first question is trust. This is not a scientific issue. It's not something that can be answered scientifically. But sure, do you have reason to mistrust a non-democratically elected government that is known for hiding things? And 23, 24 years ago, they did hide the origin of the initial SARS outbreak in the fall of 2002. But that was a big mistake that they kind of, realized that they should have let the world know earlier about that outbreak, and outbreaks that occurred afterwards were reported to the WHO and to the world in general. But yeah, it's a reasonable place to start to ask about trust and whether all the information was given to us. And certainly after March 2020, when fingers started to be pointed by our government at their government, yeah, you could feel the scientific community in China closing down, and anything that they were doing at that point had to be approved at higher governmental levels. So we had a collaborator in China who in April 2020 was pulled off our work because he wasn't allowed to work with us anymore. So trust is an issue. This is, again, something that we do with politics and human reasoning, not something that we do with science. The samples. So what can we do with science, and what do we know about those early samples? It's a little hard to believe that the samples were placed there intentionally. I don't know what level of proof you would need to show something like that, but I don't believe it. And the thing that sample set tells you, so when I say that sample set, I mean the December 2019 PCR positive COVID samples and the early January 2020 PCR positive COVID samples. What that sample set shows you is that they were in fact all around the market. It shows you that there was no other point of origin, so there's no other cluster of cases in any other part of Wuhan. And the sample set also shows you that if you rewind and go back in time to just December or just the earliest part of December, it shows you that they cluster closer and closer around the market. And when you go to that part of December before anybody knew that the market was a suspect, and you take the first 19 samples that were collected before they started looking for things at the market, so they couldn't have been biased in any way. These were just people in a hospital with pneumonia. Out of those first 19 samples, 10 were associated with the market. So it's a large proportion of the samples in a tiny geographic area of Wuhan that came from one place. So this is the reason that most of us look where all the PCR positive COVID samples are and say, look, the place where all the initial virus samples are, that's the place where the pandemic probably started.
But it's important context here.
I just said one thing. That's one thing. I think it's the whole thing when you had brought up, David, this human super spreader. You have, why did they look in the market? Because that's exactly where SARS-1 started. It started in a market. In Foshan, right? So that would be a reasonable place, right? Because you have the kind of animals there that would be intermediate host from bat to host to human. So you find that they aren't clustered around the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is like more than 7 miles away on the other side of the Yangtze River. So what happens then is a human super spreader went right to a place where you would expect an animal to human spillover event to occur. Not only that, it was two separate lineages. So it had to be two human super spreaders who then went to that area where they could have gone to any other of a million places in Wuhan, like a sporting event or grocery store or other place of worship, where other people gather. But no,
Paul, explain that. So you're saying the when we look at some early cases of people with COVID and you look at the virus, there's two genetic lines, right?
That's right. Sorry, yeah, lineage A, lineage B. So there's two. But first of all, animal to human spillover events happen all the time. These aren't rare events. You have, for example, if you look like in rural China, and you look at people who live in rural China, not that far away from bats, and you test their blood to see whether they've been exposed to bat coronaviruses, you'll find roughly 1 in 40 will. So therefore, bat coronaviruses are infecting people all the time. It just so happened, it has to happen at one particular moment where it's like climbing Everest, right? I mean, everybody's trying to climb Everest. Finally, somebody gets there. That's sort of what happens here. I think you just had the right place at the right time. Remember, these, whatever animal or animals it was that were in that part of the market are having like 50 human contacts a day, far more than that one person, or now two people, since it was two lineages, that happened to go right to a place where an animal to human spillover would occur. I guess it's like Occam's razor, right? It's not that the simplest solution is the best. It's the solution that engenders the fewest objections. And I think that the lab leak hypothesis engenders far more objections than do the data that sort of support this animal to human spillover event. But so I'm sorry, David, I interrupted what you were going to say.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would just a few complications. One is, this is, as we know, this is a disease that is spread in a quite stochastic way. 90% of cases infections come from 10% of cases. Most people who got the disease early on didn't spread it to anyone, which is to say that you could imagine a lot of seeding out into Wuhan that just didn't get spread very effectively, or at all, to someone who got sick enough to go to a hospital and be recognized. Now, I'm not saying I know that happened, but in my mind, it's an important context. It's not like every case of COVID created a very sick person who would be monitored in a hospital. And it's not like every case of COVID in that initial strain spread the disease very effectively. In fact, most did not. So if you imagine the early spread of the disease, you really have to imagine many dead ends and just a few chains of transmission. Now, in my mind, the question is, how likely is it that one of those successful chains of transmission goes to the market, which, Paul, as you were saying, is the natural site of suspicion if you're investigating a new disease like this. And for me, I think you raised some important points, but I would raise some points on the other side as well. One of which is this is a market that on a day every day had 100,000 people passing through it. On the weekends, had 1 million people passing through it. 10,000, 100,000 people passing through it. These are large numbers of people that are going through here. It's an environment that is in many ways naturally suited to spreading disease. Lots of cold surfaces, et cetera. And it wouldn't, it's not maybe the first place that you would bet that a disease would show up if a lab leak had happened at the Wuhan Institute, but it's not a bad candidate. If you were telling a story that's like, we're imagining this somehow gets out of the lab and then creates, mass infection in Wuhan, this is probably one of the few places that you would look, even independent of the wildlife trade. You would just say, here's a place where many people are coming through all the time. There's a lot of, it's cold. There's not a lot of fresh air. It is one of the candidates for that happening. And my understanding, you guys may know the science in somewhat more detail than I do, but my understanding of the lineage A, lineage B claim is that there's a lot of debate about exactly how to interpret that set of data. There's also an intermediary lineage. They've found some evidence of a previous strain that did infect humans. Lineage, most of the cases, maybe even all of the cases of the human cases identified around the market were lineage B, which is the later evolutionary stage. And it would be curious in my mind that the later evolutionary stage was much more effective and pervasive, although I know that there are genetic reasons why it had advantage in spreading. But nevertheless, it seems to me that there is not scientific consensus that the arrival of the appearance of those two lineages at the market demonstrates definitively a double spillover at the market. There have been papers published that take issue with that. So I would just say, in a really big picture, we have a mass of early cases clustered around a market. That cluster is not entirely due to the sampling bias of Chinese authorities, but reflects to some degree the sampling choices of Chinese authorities. We have no known animal infections, predate. There's no animal reservoir that we found. And we see, a large cluster of spread in this environment that is conducive to human spread. And that, to me, whether you want to say that that's proof, I wouldn't say it's proof at all. I think that it's just a complication to the simple story that these bits of evidence show in a clear way that we can say confidently, that this is a natural origin. I would like to see, that much more about the path through animals to humans than we've been able to identify to say so confidently that
they killed the animals. This was the problem. They killed the animals by January 1st. So unlike SARS-1, where they still had the animals and you could test them, they didn't have that here, which only helped fuel the conspiracy. But let me turn it over to Maciej.
Well, so Maciek, let me also set this up that Maciek has spent a ton of time in Southeast Asia. I think he's visited, 1,000 wet markets. That's a lot of lunch, Maciek, that you go shopping for. But Maciek, I know it's expensive. Maciek, jump in about what you're hearing and also help take us through. Here's me. I want you to lay this out like it's like true crime. Okay. Help me understand just the step by step of how you have investigated this and address some of the things that David is raising.
Okay. So I kind of want to talk about trust and communication, but let's do the lineage A, lineage B stuff first. Let's do some of the market stuff and just interrupt when we need to. So lineage A and lineage B, these are two viral lineages that are only 2 mutations apart. That means they're very close to each other, and nobody's yet found the intermediary that's just 1 mutation from either one. So I'm sure it exists, but we just haven't found it. It was never sampled. So these 2 lineages either emerged at the same time, like the last week of November or the last 2 weeks of November 2019. That's the most probable time if they emerged separately. Or they emerged as one lineage in early November and then acquired a couple mutations each or 1 mutation each to make it look a few weeks later like it was 2 lineages. So one of those 2 things happened. Now, the early November hypothesis is a little less believable. And that's because from early November all the way to the end of December, if that was the start of the epidemic, you would have had about 10,000 infections by December 31st, 2019. And that's too many. That's not consistent with what we saw in December 2019. So it seems to me that the more probable is that it was 2 jumps and, maybe 3, maybe 4 jumps in late November. And then, if there was a 3rd one or a 4th one, it just never went anywhere and it wasn't ever sampled. So that's the lineage A, lineage B stuff. And then the wet market stuff, which we've been talking about, David and Paul both brought up this context, and about, our sort of prior and default beliefs as to where an outbreak like this would come from. It is true that there are 2 billion people in East and Southeast Asia that do their regular grocery shopping in markets that they're not called wet markets and they're not called live animal markets. If you live in East or Southeast Asia, they're just called markets and they happen to have live animals in them sometimes. I lived in Ho Chi Minh City for 8 years and I ran research studies at farms and at markets and I visited hundreds. I don't know if I've visited up to 1,000, but there was one 5 minutes from my house that I would go to do my regular groceries at. And yeah, as an expat living in Vietnam, I was, within 24 inches of a live animal once a week. So these contacts between live animals and people, they happen at the scale of millions per day. So this is the reason that we got avian flu outbreaks 20 years ago and a new type of avian flu outbreak in China 10 years ago and several coronavirus outbreaks over the last 20 years. These are the basic reasons, and we normally are able to trace them back to animal populations. We're almost never able to trace them back to the exact animal. That's kind of hard. But we normally do get to find a reservoir. We can sort of see how they come into contact with humans. And probably the next thing we should talk about is what happened on January 1st, 2020, because the lack of animal sampling on January 1st, 2020 made it so we couldn't get all the information that we wanted about what the likely animal reservoir was in 2019 that this jumped from.
And just to be clear, Paul, when you were talking earlier and said that all the animals were killed, you meant because of that. You didn't mean by the virus itself, or did you mean by the virus?
I guess the Chinese health department reported just decided they were going to, for purposes of safety, we're going to kill all the animals. You lost.
Guys, we call it depopulating.
Yeah. Maciek, isn't it true that, Yangjin Zhang published a paper that found an intermediate lineage between A and B last year? This is stuff that you would know the details of, but better than I do. But
So I'm just going to say that I don't know the details of this. I have been following all the lineage A and lineage B papers, and to my knowledge, there's currently no intermediate known virus. I could be wrong, but we can check and put it in the show notes later.
Hey, Paul, obviously you're coming down on the animal to human transmission theory. What is the best argument to your ear for the lab leak? And we know you don't support that theory, but like when you hear the points being made there, which one do you say, okay, yeah, that is something that, we as a scientific community should have wrestled with more or need to wrestle with still?
Well, I think we should have done a better job of explaining right up front that, yes, there was funding by NIAID through EcoHealth to Xi Jiangli and her group there, and just explain it. And it's not easily explained, but I think it should have been explained right up front. That would have helped. And to explain, as David alluded to, exactly what gain-of-function research is and what it isn't. Because the minute you hear gain-of-function research, you assume functions gained. Sort of like the vaccine adverse events reporting system. People think that's where you report vaccine adverse events, whereas it should be called the suspected vaccine adverse events reporting system. So I think it's a lot of it is in the language. I think what you fight against with lab leak, and David sort of alluded to is it's fun. Here it's very attractive, right? That you have, a evildoer behind the curtain there who means to do you harm. And this is not new, by the way. The Black Death in the 1300s was blamed on Jewish people basically poisoning the water. The 1918 flu pandemic, which killed 50 million people, was blamed on German U-boats. HIV as a cause of AIDS was blamed on the CIA conducting experiments that got out of hand in Haiti when they were doing, research there. So to create a bioweapon. And that's, Nobel Prize winners bought into that. So it's very easy to see how this can happen. That we've invented a conspiracy to explain this is typical and expected, and compelling. It's just, I think, wrong. And it's much harder to explain this notion of animal to human spillover events, which occur all the time. And it's harder to assign blame there. You'd like to, like at the end of Crime and Punishment, when with Raskolnikov, when finally you get this definitive thing. He stands up and he says, it was me who killed the old pawnbroker woman and her daughter Lisbetta. It would be like that, except it would be a raccoon dog here. So.
Okay, the fact that we're talking Dostoevsky, this shit is deep, and I'm here for it. David Wallace-Wells.
Yeah, and David.
Wait, stand by. Yeah. Wait, look, I'm going to air traffic control this for a second. Yeah. Tom Johnson, David Wallace-Wells, Maciek. Hang on, Tom. Here we go. Go,
David.
Tom.
We need you to answer that question too. What's the best argument for lab leak? And the phrase, I don't know if it's been uttered yet, which I'm shocked. People are losing bets right now. Is furin cleavage site? Can you just explain that?
I was actually going to say that, bringing that up separately, which is just to say when we talk, Paul was talking about the way that this was communicated about how forthcoming scientists were about their research, and I think here is one really clear example. We found out, I believe in 2022, because of a FOIA request, that there had been a proposal to do work on bat coronaviruses involving the engineering, the insertion of furin cleavage sites, which is a distinct feature of SARS-CoV-2 when related to its local family of viruses. It's not unheard of in nature generally, but it is.
It makes a virus. It helps a virus infect a human cell, right? It helps it make it more dangerous.
Yes. And we learned, because there was a FOIA request, that there had been a grant proposal in 2019 for work to be done of this kind in Wuhan, using bat coronaviruses and trying to produce furin cleavage sites in those bat coronaviruses. Now, that grant was not approved. It was not funded. But what was really striking, there are two things that are striking about it. One is that it tells us that work like this was being considered and possibly even done in the particular lab that we're talking about. But on some level, the second part is more striking to me, which is that in the 2 years before, none of the figures who had been involved in this grant proposal said, I have something that's important that the public knows about. I want to get out there and I want to explain why this work that we proposed did not lead to this virus being released. None of the people who had worked on that grant proposal did that. They did not talk about it. In fact, some of them, refused subpoenas and did major redactions of the things that they released and in general did not behave in a completely transparent and forthcoming way about the work that they should have known the entire time, would have raised questions and suspicions, and if they felt that they had a definitive account of why those questions and suspicions were unfounded, in my mind, political complications aside, just in the spirit of truth-seeking, truth-showing, I think should have come forward and said, we need, in talking about this story, it's probably important that we wrestle with and make proper sense of this particular grant proposal. Now, it was also the case, and in a later FOIA release, we found the sort of comments on the Word doc of it, in which some of these figures were like, we need to do this in Wuhan, but we can't be upfront about that because the American authorities would really freak out if they saw it being done in this Chinese laboratory, which we know has safety standards that aren't up to our standards. So even at the time in 2019, there was a kind of a conversation going on among many of these prominent virologists about doing research of this kind that in theory could produce a virus like this, and understanding that doing it in China was a risk that American authorities would blanch at, and strategizing how to message the grant appeal in order to avoid that oversight. Now, that's not to say that I think anyone acting in good faith here knows that this research was done and did produce this virus. I think that's still, something deeply speculative, but it is suggestive. And it goes to, as I was saying, the credibility of many of the people involved that they didn't come forward and make a full accounting of it at a time of intense public interest. Now, I understand many reasons why they would be reluctant to do that. As we've talked about, the landscape here is not all that sophisticated. The public appetite is ravenous. People are not looking in detail about the science. Those who are don't necessarily understand it all that well. And it's really complicated and perhaps even dangerous to be talking about issues like this if you don't trust that the public can properly contextualize and understand them. On the other hand, I think it is unfortunate, especially given all the blame that we want to place on the Chinese government for not being forthcoming and with their data and their experience with the pandemic early on, that many of these American institutions and American figures have also been not as forthcoming themselves. To your question, Tom, what's the best argument for a natural origin? I would say every new virus that we've ever encountered has come out of nature. We know that viruses like this are circulating not in the near vicinity of Wuhan, but in Southeast Asia. We know that, they can evolve. We have not seen direct evidence of an infection of somebody at the lab. There's some intelligence reporting about early illnesses among staff there, but there's also reason to believe that those illnesses were not really SARS-CoV-2. We don't have any kind of direct accounting of, Xi Zhengli or anyone else at the Wuhan Institute freaking out in a direct way about the risk or the possibility that this had come from their lab in the early days. That's not to say they didn't do that, but we haven't seen that evidence. And so you're just, the way that I think of it is that you have two sets of, essentially circumstantial evidence. And if you want to believe that this came out of nature, the best argument for believing that set of circumstantial evidence is that it is the way that we explain jumps of viruses throughout human history. And as Paul said earlier, an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. And I don't think we have clear-cut, hard and fast, concrete evidence that this came out of a lab. All we have are circumstantial bits of evidence that raise questions about the possibility. Now, in my view, I also think there are similar limitations to the arguments on the other side, which is why I'm not a hardcore lab leaker. I just think I'm not yet confident or comfortable saying we know in one way or the other.
First of all, hardcore lab leaker is like it's like the name of like a punk band or something. But look, I want Maciek to weigh in on this, because what I'm hearing you say, David, and this is an important point, because I think it's really fueling a lot of mistrust that we're hearing from folks who listen to our show, which is this idea that, you know, folks were trying to create this virus. They sent in a funding proposal for it. And again, I just want to make sure I'm understanding, like, did they then withdraw the proposal, or they didn't tell people?
We didn't grant the money. The U.S.
Right.
did not.
Although, just, you know, not to push this too hard, but it's also the case that oftentimes researchers do the work and then apply for the grants. So it's possible that something like that is happening here. But the U.S. government rejected the grant. So the grant money was not given. That doesn't mean the experiment wasn't done. It might have already been done, or it might have been done with other funding, but the U.S. government did not support the grant.
So I guess I think the question I want to put to you, Maciek, is like, sometimes I think what's really happening is like the world of how science normally works is like crashing into the world of the sort of absence of evidence is the evidence of absence, and also I think it's crashing into a world where it is, and our friend Caitlin Jedalina talks about this, like there is a curiosity class that demands transparency, that demands answers, that really wants to know every step of the way how something is done. And then the third part of this clash of whatever we're clashing here is that it was a pandemic that fucking killed like 30 million people and destroyed everyone's lives. So Maciek, explain that a little bit, that like sometimes I view you guys as scientists being like, yo, this is like what we do. This is what we do. And you're saying that we're like, you know, these mad scientists concocting things. Maciek, explain that a little bit.
Okay, so what's the question in front of us? Is it trust, or how we communicate to the public about the science that we do, or which one of these should we cover?
What I want you to do is even take the example of like, what was it, like Lin-Fa Wang and a few other people who like wrote this proposal, right? And I think that for a lot of people, I'm not saying for David, but it's like yet another kind of mark against science. And so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's another place where, you know, we don't know when we're doing something that we're communicating with the public. You know, you don't know when you have a grant rejected that in 5 years people are going to expect you to just make it available voluntarily. I mean, I have a lot of rejected grants on my hard drive that nobody's ever going to see. And yeah, it would take a lot for me to just sort of get that, you know, this needed to be seen by people, because otherwise I'll be under suspicion for something that could have been done. So this was a lesson for us in how the public was going to perceive what we did. I mean, I'll say on the other end that, you know, people discovered this grant through a FOIA request. I don't think they needed the FOIA request. I think they could have discovered that the University of North Carolina and EcoHealth Alliance and WIV, I think they could have discovered that they had been doing gain-of-function research over the last 10 years by just reading the papers that they had published. And again, this is, you know,
although North Carolina fought a lot of that, releasing a lot of that material, right? So there was public accounting of the work, but in the details, the university was in court fighting the release of a lot of that information, which again, not to say that's, you know, proves anything, but it shows some unfortunate hostility towards public inquiry.
That's right. It doesn't look good. So I don't know why they did that, so I'm just going to pass on this. But yeah, it doesn't look good. In the moment that it's happening, you're probably, I'm guessing a little bit here, but you're probably trying to defend yourself or defend your work or defend some of your unpublished work as a scientist. You don't get that you're violating people's trust by, say, not being transparent in this moment. I mean, this is really, honestly, it's not a statement. It's a question I kind of want to put back to you, David, because, you know, we have a way of choosing words carefully, publishing things in the academic literature, trying to express some uncertainty. And then what ends up happening is it fails as a statement to the public. So what's the answer for us? How should we communicate to the public? More or less? And is there some avenue, you know, other than the published literature, where we should be doing this clearly and plainly with people?
Well, I guess what I would say is there are sort of two levels of inquiry. Just at the level of again, pure truth seeking, putting the politics aside, I think that the way that the Proximal Origins paper was put together and published was misleading in the sense that it was not forthright about the fact that some of its authors at the outset of that enterprise harbored real suspicions that this may have been a lab origin disease. And I know that this isn't the way that papers like this are often written, but I think in terms of meeting the public where they are and being totally transparent, it would have been quite effective and even, persuasive if those authors had spoken more forthrightly and said, here is, on January whatever, I thought X, but I was convinced by Y, and now I think Z. And the way that the paper was written was much more emphatic than that. It didn't acknowledge that some of those people harbored those doubts and maybe even would have bet on a lab origin not that long before the paper was published. I don't mean to suggest that they changed their view in bad faith, although I'm not entirely willing to say that they undertook it entirely in good faith either. I just mean to say, if we connect the dots of this narrative in a generous way and say, given a superficial review, some of the scientists involved believed a lab origin was possible. Over the course of reconsidering, getting some new information, and through conversations with one another, they became convinced of another outcome. There's actually a quite vernacular way of telling that story, which might have been much more effective and also protected them from future blowback when those, Slacks and emails came out. That's, you can say that's hindsight's 2020. The complicating thing for this question, though, is, for me, ultimately, the question is, what were we trying to do in the spring of 2020? Were we really trying to truth seek? Were these people really engaged in that project? And I don't mean to sound conspiratorial here, but when I think about where we are with China and geopolitics right now, and I imagine an alternate history in which, rather than 1/3 of Americans believing the virus came out of a lab in March of 2020, it was 2/3 of Americans who believe that. And rather than Donald Trump casually saying a few things but then backing off of it, if it had been official American, public policy that this virus had emerged from a lab in China, how would that have changed our pandemic response? How would it have changed the geopolitics of the pandemic response? How would it have changed the intervening 5 years? And that's not to say that I think it's justified, given some of the complications that would have introduced to tamp down speculation about the lab origin. I think as a journalist, I like to think that the truth is the most important value here. But I'm also sensitive that, we're talking about a lot of figures, not just the scientists, but figures in government who have a complicated set of incentives and motivations. And, it's not an insane thing to say in March 2020, let's not get into an argument about responsibility here, because then immediately we're going to be in a really hostile dynamic with China. But let's try to come to a conclusion that allows us to just fight the virus and protect one another first. And again, this is not, I can't say with certainty that this was logic that was applied to this question at the time by many of these figures, but I'm not sure that it would have served the global good in the short run had we come out in a very emphatic way, had Donald Trump made it his official policy, the official posture of his administration, that this was the responsibility of China. And, would we, we're talking about a virus that killed 30 million people, right? I mean, we're talking about in terms of, cost to, global economic productivity to, global health beyond the deaths. This is a really major event. And if it had been clear in an actionable way at the level of public discourse in 2020, that it was the responsibility of a foreign government with whom we already had a hostile relationship, and indeed much of the world was suspicious of, I'm not sure that that's a recipe for, a better pandemic response. Yeah. And so, which is all just to say, this is really complicated. I don't know that I want Christian Anderson deciding the future of geopolitics. No shade to Christian Anderson. And I certainly don't want Donald Trump deciding how we interpret scientific data. So we're in a complicated situation where we don't really know exactly who to turn to. The figures that we seem to trust intuitively as a country at that time, figures like Fauci and Collins were endorsing, the proximal origins paper, I think too emphatically, given what we really knew. But nevertheless, those are the people who were doing that. And ultimately that was, consequential for the country in a counterproductive way, because 6 months, 9 months, a year and a half later, when you have the Nicholson Baker story that I published in New York Magazine coming out, you have Jon Stewart going on Stephen Colbert, the country was not rallying to the defense of scientists. They were feeling the relief of something that they had suspected for a long time finally coming out into the open. And, that's a very long-winded answer. The very short version is, anytime you expand the aperture beyond the narrow question of what we know scientifically and how we can communicate that, it gets really, really complicated.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah. Oh,
yeah. And we have one question for you, Paul. Maggie's got a question. I know we lose you in 4 minutes.
And also, Paul, just add whatever you want to it. But Maggie, go.
Maggie, jump in.
Yeah. Last question for you, Paul. What's at stake here for science? As Americans are being told to believe it was a lab leak, where does that leave the American public's relationship with science?
Well, I think that actually was what I was going to talk about.
Great.
I think the most upsetting aspect of this to me is COVID.Gov. I mean, if you look at that is a political statement, pure and simple. You see a picture of an anguished Tony Fauci right next to a pardon that was given to him by Biden. You see stuff regarding masking or vaccines, and now lab leak. We were right. We were right. We were right to question. Not only were we right to question this, we were right, period. We are going to declare that it was a lab leak. And I think that's not the way science works. I mean, the way science works is you truths emerge over time. And I think, to me, largely the truth has emerged here, but I can see where there's problems with regard to how this information has been handled. I understand all that, but I think most of the data are on support one side, which to me is an animal to human spillover event. But to declare that this was a lab leak, to declare these things is really upsetting to me. And I think that's where we are. I think we're at a point now where science is sort of losing its place as a source of truth. People declare their own truths, including scientific truths, and that therein danger lies.
Paul, can I ask you, and Maciek, both of you actually, what do you make of the recent announcements by I think was the German intelligence agency and the French Academy of Scientists, who both somewhat emphatically came out in favor of lab leak? A lot of the dynamics we're talking about are America specific, but what do you make of those consensus statements?
Because I have to do this thing.
Paul, thank you so much. We're gonna have Maciek. That was Paul Offit, y'all.
Hi, Paul.
Into the pod.
Bye all. Thanks.
David, just ask that question specifically of Maciek now.
Okay.
Oh yeah, but guys, I've seen the U.S. House, DEA, CIA, FBI reports. I haven't seen the German and the French ones.
Okay.
Just FYI.
David, what follow up?
Yeah. What do you answer your own question? What do you make of those? We're seeing other countries now concluding, or their intelligence agencies concluding, it was a lab leak. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the simplest way of answering it is to say, I think it should give us pause about concluding that it wasn't. If other actors in other countries acting under different political dynamics have come somewhat definitively to this conclusion, it's not that they're saying, we can't say with 100% certainty that it's a natural origin. We have to leave open the possibility of a lab origin, which is honestly what people like Tony Fauci have been saying now for years too. They're saying much more like, if we had to bet, we feel quite strongly that the better bet is on a lab leak. I don't think they've seen any science that we haven't seen. I don't think they've seen much intelligence that we haven't seen. Honestly, much of what the U.S. intelligence community has gathered, I think, is leaked out, and is frankly, to me, not very impressive. It's often also been leaked by China hawks and the State Department who want to intensify conflict with China. So it's not like I think there's a lot of secret information or secret knowledge out there that would flip us in one direction or the other. I just think it's a sign that, as worried as I am about scientific discourse and the state of public trust in scientists in America, I don't think that we can really blame the whole lab leak hypothesis on a purely American phenomenon. If we have other government agencies, government academies who feel confident in the other direction, we have to acknowledge that means that we're living through some amount of scientific ambiguity, which can be interpreted by different sets of scientists in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, we never got to my favorite and best arguments for lab leak. I mean, I think the things that would make this persuasive to scientists like me are the direct pieces of evidence around what was happening in that specific lab, so the Wuhan Institute of Virology in late 2019. So these are things like the laboratory inventory, illnesses of laboratory employees, accident reports, which are mandatory. If there's a laboratory accident, you have to report it, and these are, typically released to the public. So this is like the empty evidence base that we don't have, but certainly if something like this came to light, it would change how people view the origins question. And in these intelligence reports, these are also missing pieces in the U.S. intelligence reports anyway. So I haven't seen anything on specific illnesses or laboratory accidents. David mentioned maybe it's worth considering that they might be right. I mean, they are intelligence agencies. But then the question is, if they have evidence of this type, like why wouldn't they just show it to everyone? I don't know if there's a political answer to this question, but either there's no evidence of this or there is and it's being hidden or covered up. I mean, David, do you have an instinct as to whether it could be one of those two things?
Well, I'd start just by emphasizing that Congress passed a law requiring the Director of National Intelligence to release everything that had been collected on the origin of the pandemic. And that was not what happened. They produced a one-page memo summarizing a lot of additional findings. I think I mentioned earlier, there was also a claim made by a whistleblower that one of the analysts involved in one of those assessments was actually paid to change their assessment. So we haven't seen publicly the full batch of data and evidence that has led to these various agencies making the conclusions that they've made. Do I think that means they're hiding something that shows there was a lab origin? Do I think that means they're hiding something that shows there wasn't a lab origin? I'm guessing they don't have much more than we have. To the extent that we've seen peeks and glimpses through leaks, what we've seen is basically the argument, to the extent that we've seen the lab leak hypothesis as articulated by intelligence agencies, to the extent we've seen that through peaks and leaks, what we've seen is something that really resembles the conventional argument, which is, how strange that this emerged, like right next to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There were some maybe curious illnesses among people who work there, although again, the details of that are unclear and disputed. Questions about the way that the original sampling was done. It doesn't seem to me like any intelligence agency, U.S. or otherwise, is sitting on a batch of big new information. Maybe they're reluctant to share that on that basis because it would show how little more they have. On the other hand, it was not, the lab leaky Trumpy administration that released that inadequate memo. In fact, I think technically illegal memo. It didn't fulfill the requirements that were set forward by the law. It was Biden and his intelligence director, and Biden was, not completely. The Biden administration hadn't foreclosed the possibility of a lab leak, but they're also, I think, much more mindful of, not trying to stir the conspiracy here and antagonize China. So what that means and where that leaves us, I think it's pretty ambiguous. But I don't think we should be expecting that anytime soon there's like a big new skeleton key that will fall into our laps and tell us exactly what happened out of the CIA or whatever. I don't think that's coming.
Here's what I'll say just to wrap it up. I'll say, look, I think what I really appreciate about the intention you guys are bringing to this conversation is you are explaining the scientific process. You are explaining in a good faith way the questions that even that process itself may have raised. What I worry when I look at just the general discourse right now is that we are in a place where there's a real desire to find a villain in this. And I do worry that witch hunt is going to make things a little less safe for a lot of people. And I hope not. I still believe that as a society, as a democracy, we are still capable of still like having grace, that even if there were mistakes made and things like that, that this isn't something where we string people up. But I absolutely understand the desire to find accountability. So what I just want to thank you guys so much for agreeing to this. I hope this was helpful for our listeners. And I'm sure it'll raise a lot of questions. So please do send us questions at whyshoulditrustyou.net. And a huge thank you to Dr. Maciek Boni, infectious disease epidemiologist. We just lost, on the call, he just left. Dr. Paul Offit, infectious disease. He's very much with us. Dr. Paul Offit, infectious disease pediatrician, and David Wallace-Wells, who is just awesome, from the New York Times. Always here with the fantastic questions and pushing us to
Brinda,
think
can
hard
I ask,
on this.
I know we're in our conclusion here, but just since this whole thing is so organic anyway.
We love each other so much, we can't leave each other.
There's one last thing I gotta know.
Okay, go.
And just like, one word, 2 word answer here. Maciek and to David, there's no new piece of information that's going to rescue us from this debate here, right? I mean, we are cruising into our 5th year out from the pandemic. We're not going to find something we haven't already found, right? I mean,
well, look, I mean, Glasnost. I mean, if China has a Glasnost moment in 10 or 15 years,
and they open up the archives, and so it's only if it's the only theory is that if there's some big piece of information that they have that they haven't handed out yet. There's no research that could. We're not going to find some animal cruising somewhere that.
I mean, there's no more data points to collect. So the same way that Lee Harvey Oswald was killed the day after the Kennedy assassination, the market was cleaned the day after the outbreak was announced. And there's no more data to collect. So.
David, you see it the same way?
That is such a good analogy. Is this like...
Is our new JFK?
Like the raccoon dogs were killed, and just like Oswald was killed, David.
David, nothing's coming to rescue us here. No piece of information.
I don't expect it to. Yeah, I don't expect anything like that.
Great.
Thanks, guys. That was a really nice way to end the show.
Hopeful.
Yeah. It's fine. Listen, I do want to thank you. Where was I, Tom? It was such a good question, but I was in a flow. Okay, David Wallace-Wells, Maciek Boni, Paul Offit. He's Tom Johnson. She's Maggie Bartlett. I'm Brinda Adhikari. Thank you so much for the special episode of Why Should I Trust You? We will see you back here on Thursday.